and welcome. My name is Ashleigh and I'm delighted to be hosting our very first season of LearnSci Webcasts, a series all about educators helping educators. We've invited university educators to share stories about their own experiences and challenges, along with tips and tricks that you can use in your own teaching. Thank you so much for listening and I hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to this episode of LearnSci Webcast. Today we're talking about the balance between choice and structure for students' learning, and we're joined by Professor Nicky King and Dr. Shane Austin. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Okay, thanks, Ashleigh. Hi, my name is Dr. Shane Austin. I'm a lecturer in biochemistry at the University of the West Indies, specifically at the Cayfield campus in Barbados. So I lecture a number of biochemistry courses across our 3-year levels of the degree, starting with the introductory course in first year, intermediary courses in the second year, and then advanced special topics courses in the third year. I really have a passion for active learning, inquiry-based learning, so I use a lot of inquiry-based learning in my practicals and active learning in my actual classroom setting.
Thank you. Nicky?
Yeah, my name is Professor Nicky King. I am a Professor of Natural Sciences Education at the University of Exeter, and I'm also the Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education in the Faculty of Environment, Science and Economy. And on the side, I'm the Chair of the Society for Natural Sciences. So my real passion is for interdisciplinary science education. My background is in chemistry. I have a degree in chemistry and I teach chemistry to our natural sciences students here at Exeter. But as I said, my passion is interdisciplinarity and giving students choice to determine their pathways through the degree programme and the benefits of bringing together different ways of learning, different aspects of different subject areas, and trying to make the degree greater than the sum of its parts, so that all the aspects can learn and benefit from each other.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so welcome guys. Thank you so much for joining us. So today we're talking about choice versus structure in terms of student learning. What we mean by this is that some students may like to work more independently, having choice in how and when they learn, possibly thriving in that online delivery environment that we've been used to for a couple of years at least. But in contrast, other students may want, in some circumstances, to want and need more structure, often provided by the educator to learn successfully. So we're exploring today how an educator can strike this balance between the two to basically meet all student expectations, which in itself is a challenge. So my first question to you both is, what impact do you think the pandemic has had on students' expectations of flexible learning environments? And if you can share any experiences of any changes in those student attitudes you've faced recently. Nicky, would you like to kick us off with that one?
Thanks, Ashleigh. Yeah, I think to begin with in the pandemic, it was very much let's get everything online. Let's do everything, provide everything to students. We provided huge amounts of stuff in terms of recorded lecture materials, recorded supplementary materials, extra reading, all sorts of bits and bobs of support. And then we moved back into the sort of slightly more hybrid with lectures in person as well, or certainly with labs in person. And I think one of the things that perhaps we neglected was thinking about how the students would interact and use with those resources. And some students, particularly to begin with, just tried to do everything all of the time. And I think, some students found that incredibly stressful and huge amounts of work. And the time they spent using the interactive resources, the pre-recorded stuff, was way beyond the amount of time they'd spend in a lecture. And so I think it's taken time for both students and staff to find a sort of an equilibrium position whereby we know how people are using those resources and the balance. And I think one of the things that we've learned particularly is around the importance of the narrative that supports that learning, the narrative of how and where and when resources fit together and what's core and compulsory and what's optional, and an understanding of how different groups of students are using those. And I think it's a process that we're learning but still undergoing. And I think students are learning it as well as to how to balance those things. But I think an important aspect of that is that narrative around how it all fits together.
Yeah, thank you. Shane, anything to add to that?
Yes. Yeah, I think there were a lot of really good points that Nicky made there that kind of reflected my own experience, especially I think during the core of the pandemic where there were lots of lockdowns and we weren't doing a lot of face-to-face instruction. I also, there was a point where I was putting up all these materials, all these readings. I was also putting up, all these lecture recordings and additional recordings. And in some cases, we were having some that were delivered hybrid or some that were even done asynchronously. So there was so much content that the students had to absorb. And one of the biggest things and perhaps challenges that I saw with our students was what Nicky was talking about, in that between what was compulsory and what was additional reading, the lines started to become blurred because there was so much content there. There was so much available for them. They could get different things, the same thing sometimes in different modalities. And it became kind of very confusing for them sometimes to follow the path of what was really taking them to achieving the learning objectives for some students, because they were just focusing on some elements and really just not focusing on some of the other more nuanced points that perhaps we might have been able to bring out in a face-to-face tutorial using a case study or doing something a little bit more practical. So I do really share that experience. Generally, as a thought, I do think my students, for the most part, tended to enjoy the flexibility at the start. I think coming on to the end, the flexibility mixed with the various modalities that we were using became a little bit exhausting for them. And I really felt that exhaustion both in the quality of assessments that they were producing, but also just hearing it in general feedback from them.
I think that point around assessment is quite interesting, because one of the things I found talking to final year students who had pre-pandemic experience, that sort of standard undergraduate experience where they had gone along to lectures, made their notes in the lectures, perhaps flick through them a bit, they'd get to an assessment, then they'd go back and think, oh goodness, I've got a load of work to do for this assessment. This sort of becomes that slight cramming period where you're preparing for the assessment and then get rid of that and you go along and you're taking a few notes, but you're not doing a huge amount of work necessarily outside the lectures. And then you get to revision and it's that really intense revision period. And what some of the third years reflected on is that they found that they were learning differently. So they were spending much more time early on going through lectures, pausing material, pausing my recorded stuff, taking notes, doing the worked examples for themselves. An hour's lecture could take them 2.5, 3 hours because they were going through it differently. And they thought, oh my goodness, I've got so much work to this is so much harder. And then they'd get to that period before the exam and suddenly think, oh, hang on, I know this better than I did when I started revising in previous years, because they'd learned deeply, many of them, to begin with, rather than a sort of surface learning to begin with and deep later on. Now, not all students took that approach, but it's quite interesting to hear that some of them felt that they had done that deep learning at a different stage because of the resources and the ways of learning, and partly because they couldn't go out, socializing in the same way because there wasn't much to do, but that it had changed the way they thought about learning and it changed the way they sort of understood that learning process for themselves and their own, preference for way to learn.
If I could, Ashleigh, I just wanted to just tap one comment on there to what Nicky was saying. I found very much the same thing, especially in the final year students, more advanced students, but in the students who never really had any opportunity to experience our university examination process before, those first year students and the ones then eventually who went into the second year. I do think what Nicky's saying is very true of our cohort of students and what we saw there. Those third year students felt a lot more prepared, even though sometimes they felt overwhelmed by the content. I think they felt a lot more prepared. And some of what I was speaking about earlier, perhaps more related to the first and second year students who never had this experience of university examinations. All they were getting were these kind of continuous assessments throughout. And that, I think, is a very interesting and key point there.
Mm. And I think we've merged, now we're coming to a different point where the students have learnt to learn in a slightly different way, but we're now back to full normal face-to-face, same number of contact hours. I've got 3-hour lab class tomorrow, perfectly, standard pre-2019 sort of approach to doing that. But the students are learning differently because of their pandemic experiences. And some staff have really adapted to that. So some staff have changed their face-to-face, perhaps more flipped classroom approach. They're doing different things in those sessions. Some staff are just saying, well, I'll just trot out the lecture I've always done. It's easy. I can do it. And then you end up with something which is sort of the same as the version that's online. But I'll admit, my online pre-records are much better because I edited them and I edited out the mistakes and the slip-ups and the tongue-tie moment. And so there's an engagement question, because if what you're getting when you go in person is a slightly messier version of what's online, why do I go in person? So what's the value, the added value of in person? And we get into this I think certainly in the UK, I don't know what it's like in the West Indies, but we got into this position where students aren't coming necessarily, or last year weren't coming to the in-person because it was a slightly messier version of what was online. And actually I can learn more flexibly in my own time online, but I'm not getting added value from being in person. And then the incentive isn't there for staff to change their in-person because they feel like the students aren't coming. And we need to overcome that barrier of saying, okay, how in an easy way can we rethink a little bit around the in-person such that it doesn't exclude those who struggle with the online and they still cover all the material, but those who do both are getting value added from being in person. And I think that's quite challenging for a number of academics. Some people really embrace it and have absolutely flown, and they've transformed the way they're delivering stuff. But many academics find that quite uncomfortable. And it's a challenge for us to balance that sort of the flexibility for students and what staff are able to do and how we can support them to do some of that in person in a value added way.
You've come really nicely onto the second question of really how do we weigh up this basically this flexibility versus structure in this post-pandemic world now. And yeah, it's an amalgamation, isn't it, of the good things that we used to do pre-pandemic and the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic and bringing all that together. How do you think the higher degree of flexibility that perhaps, generally speaking, students may now expect affects students with special educational needs? Is that something that you have to take into account on your courses regularly?
I can jump in there. I think students with those special educational needs, I do think that some of them really benefited from having the availability of those either pre-recorded resources or recorded resources, or having transcriptions of the various recordings, whether it be via one of the video streaming services or whether it be done independently. So I really do think some of those students benefited. I do think in the case of other populations of students with learning disabilities, I do think that they perhaps became a little bit overwhelmed by what we were talking about earlier, because they had so much information coming at them from different modalities, kind of coming back to that point of sometimes some of the information was repetitive, and then other times, nuanced information was introduced in a written lecture note that they might not have encountered previously because they came to the lecture and they would have done a full tutorial or something like that accompanying it. So I do think the added flexibility has helped most of those students with learning disabilities that I have seen, at least at our campus. But I do think that there are a few who really yearned for and wanted to be back in a face-to-face way, which they were familiar with. That I think, from my experience, that's what I noticed. Those students were generally familiar with and were conversant of how their learning style best fit into a face-to-face environment. And the moment that this new variable of all of these options and all this stuff and all this online learning was added, it really did do a bit of undoing in their educational advancement.
And I think the other group related to this, a lot of those students are at higher risk of dropping out, of struggling. And one of the challenges for us is students who are more and more moving towards wanting the online, because, if you've got social anxiety or something, to be able to not attend the lecture, but be able to, go through the material at your own pace, at your own time, it's fantastically helpful. But if you're also a student who's in danger of struggling, of disengaging, of dropping out, how do we identify and contact those students and keep identify where they're at risk and make sure that we can support them. And I think many universities at the moment are grappling with that question of attendance versus engagement. What is it that helps us identify students in need of support, students in need who may be struggling, and identify them before the point where they fail stuff. You run lab classes. You know that if someone misses a number of lab classes in a row, you're going to follow up with them. They're not necessarily assessed things, but you can pick that up quite easily. If and labs perhaps not the best example because you can't really do that online. But if all your seminars are moved online, and it's much harder to identify where a student is struggling or dropping out or failing to attend, because they may it's easy to assume they're engaging in a different way. So I think that is one of the challenges. So there's great benefits for particular groups of students of that flexibility. But I think we need to acknowledge that it comes with risks, and we need to be able to identify those students, but we also need to have systems that enable us to do that. And I think one of the challenges with the pandemic is presented with lots of opportunities, but in some respects, we moved so fast that we don't have many of the systems and, frankly, campuses that are fit for the way in which we might think we want to teach. So, if we think about if moving online and flexible approaches to learning had been planned, we would have done it over many years. We would have restructured our campuses so we didn't have huge, great lecture theatres. We had lots more small group teaching spaces. If I envisage my perfect curriculum in a flexible learning world, it would be pre-recorded theory materials supported by endless lab sessions. I'd be in the lab, days on end. If I had infinite time, I'd be in the lab days on end doing experiments that supported the theory. They'd do the theory beforehand. They'd come in. We'd work through it in those environments. But we don't have the campus to support that. We have one teaching lab. It's fully booked, back to back all week. We can't do those sorts of things. And similarly, if we'd moved online, flexible plan, we would have put in place engagement tracking systems so we could identify whether students were engaging with the materials and when and how. But we moved in an instant. And now I think there's lots of people who want to do really good things, but the supportive stuff, the physical campus, but also our online environments and the systems that support those are playing catch up. And so we're in this slightly uncomfortable ground of having run before we can walk a little bit.
There were two things there, but I'll only touch on one, just to perhaps keep the conversation a bit more streamlined. But I think the point that Nicky made about, the ways of identifying some of those students who are prone to falling behind, I think, especially during when we were offering all this flexibility and we were online, our ways of finding those students and really measuring engagement did not keep up with the times. And I think that that's one of the areas that, this entire online learning experience has really done a bit of a disservice to the students, in that the ways that we were kind of thinking we can use to measure a student's engagement with the content and with the material, they just weren't authentic. They just didn't really reflect what students were doing. And that, I think of a really good example in one course where I was looking at our learning management system, and I was just kind of perusing, trying to use that as a gauge for how much were these particular students engaging with the lecture content. And, then I reached out to some students, and then they quickly pointed out, well, sir, I'm just getting the lectures, I'm getting the links email from my friend. My friend clicks on it, and, then we both watch the link together, or, something like this. So it's like using how much they were engaging with just a link on the course learning page was not enough, because so much had changed about our life and how we interacted with each other as persons that, the ways that we were measuring a student being disengaged were just not authentic anymore, and they just didn't really serve to capture those students. And I think, that run-on point that Nicky made about how our physical facilities mirror that is so true, because a lot of our physical facilities are not really prepared for how we're coming back to now lecture and how we're coming back to now deliver content.
Mm. Okay, so this leads us quite nicely onto our third question. So obviously, our campuses may not be set up for that perfect world scenario that we would really love at the moment. But, if we could give some top tips to some other fellow educators about how they could meet this challenge, how they could try and meet these expectations and needs of all students and strike that balance. Is there anything that comes to your mind now of what they could do to help that situation other than build a new university campus?
Sure. I think, Ashleigh, there's one thing that just sticks out to me. And I think it's, try different things, but be willing to engage with the students. I think a lot of the time, especially if I think back to my pre-pandemic way of teaching compared to what happened during the pandemic and now coming out of it, how I'm instructing. I think before I used to rely a lot on the kind of the retrospective look of the student evaluations. I kind of read what they did, what they said, I reflected on it. Some of it's useful and some of it isn't. It's true, but I tried to reflect on what I could do to change my practice. But I found during the pandemic, actually asking the students who were there in front of you that were part of this cohort, well, look, what can I do? What can I put into the course? What can I remove from the course that might serve you better? I think is a really good way to start. I mean, I'm not saying you have to tailor your entire curriculum for a semester around only what the students want, but you know what your learning objectives are. And the reality is that you're the expert also on the pedagogy. Likely you're better able to think about how you can bring over these points using the tools that you have in your arsenal to the students. So you give them some options and you think, well, how about would you like this first entire module on a particular topic? Would you like that to be delivered only by recordings? And then we can focus more deeply in tutorial time in the actual on tutorials in the actual class time. And conversely, would you like perhaps face-to-face lectures on this so I can interact with you in the whiteboard, and then we can easily kind of segue into the lab that follows immediately after. So I think asking the students what they kind of want in terms of the experience, or at least just providing, I think, the title of this was structure and choice, and I think kind of providing structured choice for them. So they do have some options. You're not giving them, everything is not on the table for every single part of the class, but just offering them, well, look, for this particular module, these are the options. And for this module, this just has to be delivered in this particular way because it can be most integrated. And explain the pedagogy to them. Perhaps that's going to be my last point. Explain why you're choosing that modality, explaining why you think that's important. Because until very recently, and I know it might be shocking, I didn't really buy into or believe until I started doing it the value of how engaged students can become with a particular activity if you just simply explain to them the skills that they're going to gain from it. Sometimes they look at you, ask them to do an assessment for an activity, and they're like, this is very random. It doesn't really have any real world bearing. And then you explain to them, well, in the real world, this is what we do. We interact with colleagues. We end up peer, assessing colleagues. Somebody assesses us, and you explain to them each of the different facets relate to the real world and particular activities. So I think if you explain your pedagogy in the same way and why you chose that, I think it would be really, really beneficial to students.
Yeah, I'll just pick up, I think, on that point you made. I really like what you said about structured choice or structured flexibility, because I think one error you can make as an educator is trying to be all things to all people, trying to do too much. But actually saying, well, okay, these are the things that I can do. These are the things that work for, the subject I teach, my personal approach to pedagogy, the way in which I am comfortable teaching. There's some stuff that I just couldn't do. It just, it doesn't fit with my teaching, with my style, with what makes me confident, because you want a confident and happy member of staff, because then they're enthusiastic about the subject and it comes across. So think about what works. And as you said, a number of options possibly, or, we can provide this sort of flexibility, but I can't do those things. And don't be afraid to say that there's certain stuff that in this particular topic is not appropriate, won't work. And don't, because I think, the risk here when you're talking about asking students, but also the risk when there's so many new approaches that have come up, and you've got colleagues bombarding you with, I did it this way and I did this amazing thing and this worked brilliantly, and why don't you try so and so, or such and such must be, talk to so and so because they've got this great thing that works really well. You can't do everything, and so you've got to think about what is realistic and supportive for your students, but also supportive for yourself and the colleagues that you're working with on a particular course or module. So be ambitious, but don't bite off more than you can chew.
Another careful balance.
Yeah, that's a prime. I think that's the best advice for your entire educational career. I think, be ambitious, but really don't bite off more than you can chew. Just, take it one bite at a time, and you will eventually be able to conquer that whole apple, whatever it is that you're taking on. But yeah, I think that's really good advice, Nikki.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. That kind of came to the end point of the questions that we had. Unless you have anything else additional to add, I think that was a lovely, really lovely conversation. So I suppose we'll wrap it up there. So Shane and Nikki, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and your experiences in this whole balancing act of student learning. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you in the next episode. But in the meantime, we'd love to hear your thoughts. So please tweet us at LearnSci HQ for any comments on today's episode or anything you'd like to hear from us in the future. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.